Welcome to our masterclass today that I'm calling Inspect Your Health Foundation. And I really want to focus on some fundamental things, partly because I see a lot of people in our membership struggling with some of these things. And it's very understandable because of natural human tendencies. So let's consider some of these tendencies up front. When this man was asked, how do you write a great novel? He had a really interesting answer. You might recognize him as Ernest Hemingway, one of the greatest authors that this country has ever produced. And his answer to how do you write a great novel was exactly what you see on your screen. First, you clean out the refrigerator. Now, that's an unusual answer. What did he actually mean by that? He meant that when you're faced with a task that seems really big, it may feel hard or even potentially insurmountable. If you decide that you really want to do that thing, often you reach for a low-hanging fruit where you feel like you can have an easy victory. And if you wake up in the morning thinking about, oh, I've got to write a novel, that just feels like so much to do that you might look for something easier. Like, well, I'm going to clean out the refrigerator first. And nowadays, I think what most people do is they reach for something like, well, I better respond to this email. And then that leads to a few more emails, and that leads to some other distractions, and that leads to spending the first 4 hours of the day doing anything except working on your novel if you're a writer. When it comes to our health, we have the same natural tendency. We look for easy wins. We go for things that feel like we're going to accomplish something. And maybe we do, but busyness is not necessarily productivity. Our default mode as humans is to look for those easy wins. We want clarity. We want simplicity. We want certainty. And when there's some idea that, oh, if I do this thing, then it's very quickly going to improve things for me, that's attractive. That sounds good to most of us as humans, but it gets us into trouble, especially when it comes with efforts to optimize our cognitive, mental, and physical health, because advertisers can prey on that. It's a natural human tendency when something's wrong with our health to want a quick, easy fix from someone that we trust that stands up with authority and says, here is what you do. And if that comes in the form of a supplement or a medication that we can take, and it's going to make a major difference for us, and we're going to feel better very quickly, that is playing to our natural tendency, our default mode, to want to pick off an easy win. The unfortunate thing is that often just keeps us stuck. I met with someone very recently who had a very, very long list of supplements. And yet this individual had been trying for years to overcome some pretty serious symptoms. And there were fundamental things that were addressable, but if those supplements were going to fix it, they would have fixed it a long time ago. They weren't fixing it. And that was an example of someone falling into this default mode of just seeing an advertisement that, oh, this supplement is supposed to be good for this thing. So for example, let's suppose that you have brain fog and you feel like you have a hard time focusing. It's the natural human tendency to see an advertisement or read an article or talk to somebody who says, hey, this supplement's really good for focus. And it feels easy. And so you just try it. You implement it. And the worst thing that could happen is that maybe you spend a little bit of money and you don't get the result. I think that that's very understandable. It's human nature. But it's not paying attention to the fundamental formula for improved brain health, and it's not paying attention to foundational things. So we've talked here before about the fact that if you want to get a brain better, the formula is to calm immune activation and increase energy production, and that gives you better cognitive and mental health. And this idea is really based on several different things, but it started with research that came out in about 2014, where Dr. Robert Naviaux at UCSD, who is a mitochondrial expert, recognized that mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell, don't just produce energy. they actually do other things. They are a sort of switch for the immune response. And when a pathogen comes into the body and the immune system needs to fire up, mitochondria shift out of energy production into a state that Dr. Naviaux called the cell danger response. And what that looks like outwardly, or what we might perceive, is a drop in energy. Well, that can happen throughout the body, but it can also happen in a localized area, like a part of the brain or throughout the brain. When energy production drops, it's noticeable outwardly. And when immune activation fires up, when the immune system is really turned on and cranking, we feel it. So if we can start with this idea, if we recognize, hey, it's fundamental. If I want to have my brain at a better place, I've got to figure out what's firing up the immune system and what is limiting energy production. Then that leads us a little bit more in the direction of what would actually solve the challenges that we're facing. So imagine that you're building a house. And imagine that the contractor comes in and sets the forms and pours the foundation. And you go over to the site of your new house and you look at the foundation and it's a mess. It's a real problem. Let's say that there are major cracks in the foundation. There's concrete that's breaking down. There's rebar that they forgot to put in it. You see this whole pile of rebar off to the side and you think, oh my goodness, they didn't put that in the foundation. Virtually everybody would talk to the contractor and say, you got to do this over. We can't build a house on that kind of foundation. Everyone knows that if you build on a terrible foundation, no matter how beautiful things are above the level of the foundation, the house is not going to be stable. It won't be the house that you want to live in. If your house looks like this picture, which is AI generated, but if it looks like this, where, oh, it's beautiful above ground, but everything underneath it is cracking and rotted and unsupported, then the house is going to cave in on itself. It's never going to work. When it comes to our health, the same thing is true. We have to start with foundational things. There's a whole lot of stuff that is above the level of the ground. And if we aren't focused on the foundation, we get into trouble. And yet, it's default mode. It's very easy to focus on the gingerbread and the paint color and to focus on how the room looks before we ever think about the foundational things. So when it comes to our health, we often talk here at A Mind for All Seasons about how important it is to begin with a healthy foundation. Let's get that right. And I don't want to beat a dead horse. I don't want to talk about things that just seem overly simple, except for the fact that what is simple to do is simple not to do. And I'm seeing more and more members in our community that perhaps are not focused enough on building a strong, healthy foundation. So let's consider a few things. We know that it's important to eat brain food. And we've talked before about how important it is to focus on principles, not tribalism. So let's review a few of these principles. And I'm going to go through some basic information here about the foundation, and then we're going to have a discussion at the end of this. So I want you dropping questions in the chat or thinking about things that you might want to discuss about the foundations of really solid health. But to review these principles related to how we eat, fasting is foundational for all of us. And that doesn't mean that we should all be fasting 18 hours a day. That's not what I'm saying. In fact, I think that sets some people back. Every case is unique. Some people need to lose significant weight and they have some very serious metabolic health problems. And fasting might be a helpful tool in the toolbox to help improve insulin sensitivity. When I say fasting is foundational, what I mean is all of us need to be thoughtful of times that our gut does not have to process food. And a good rule of thumb is that we should have at least 12 hours from when we eat an evening meal to when we eat again the next day. Even people that are very thin and getting older and need to fuel their bodies pretty consistently still benefit from having that window of time throughout the night when we're not eating. So, if you're trying to improve your health, but when you evaluate your foundation and you're looking for cracks in the foundation, if you're snacking at 10 o'clock at night, that's something we got to figure out. Make sure that you have at least 2.5, 3 hours from the time you eat an evening meal until you're going to bed, and that you've got at least 12 hours from that last meal till when you eat again the next day. So if you eat at 6 p.m., you don't want to eat before 6 a.m. Well, that's not that hard to do. Most people aren't eating at 6 o'clock in the morning anyway. Make sure that you're eating real food. If it was made by a chemist instead of a cook, there's a problem with it. So, whether you're talking about your own health or you're one of our long-term care professionals that's in our community and you're serving other people, what could we do to make sure that we're eating more real food that is only mildly processed and not ultra processed stuff that doesn't even look like anything that you find in the natural world? Another important principle is that food is fuel, and the way that we fuel ourselves depends on how we're running the engine. One of our members was talking to me earlier today, and she was discussing how hard it is for her to recover from physical exercise. She's doing a great job getting to a gym and working with a group of people and staying active, but she's not really recovering very well. And as we discussed things, it was clear that she probably needs to fuel herself differently based on how she's running the engine. She's very thin. She's not trying to lose any weight. She's actually trying to improve muscle mass, but she wasn't getting any sort of carbohydrate to really speak of in her diet. And that's important for replacing glycogen stores in the muscles. So we talked about a way to fuel herself a little bit differently to meet her specific individual need. Whatever we do, we've got to control our sugars because elevated blood sugar is really damaging to the brain and the body. So if our blood sugar is crashing and spiking all over the place, that's going to be really stressful on the body, and we need to be thoughtful about how we approach that. We need to understand that hormones drive both hunger and the sense of satiety, of feeling full. And just because we're feeling something and we're sensing hunger, for example, doesn't mean that we have to eat. We can make choices based on our goals and based on what we know of our body and how it's responding. And just because we feel full doesn't mean that we might not need to eat. So understand those signals. And also understand that food timing really can matter. Not just how late in the evening are you eating, but are we eating before a workout? Are we eating after a workout? What are we eating before we do brain-related kinds of work versus physical kinds of work? Now, there are some common mistakes. And I wanted to call these out here because I see people in our community sometimes struggling with these things. And this is certainly not to point fingers at anyone. This is intended to be helpful. Sometimes one of the tools that a person might use to improve brain health is a tool like a ketogenic diet. And there can be some real advantages to a ketogenic diet. It's not for everybody. And I think for most people, it's not a tool to use consistently all the time, long term. But there are benefits of cycling in and out of ketosis. That said, the most common mistake that I see people make when it comes to a ketogenic diet is they do an amazing job of cutting carbohydrates. They cut them way, way down, less than 30 grams of carbohydrate a day. But they do a lousy job of increasing fats. A ketogenic diet is a high-fat diet. It's where 70 to 75% of your total caloric intake is coming from fat. And the reason for that is that that is what the liver uses to make ketones. If you're trying to use a ketone as an alternate fuel source instead of a molecule of glucose, you have to give the body what it needs to produce those ketones. Now, if you're not eating at all, your body is going to access your own fat stores. And if you need to lose a couple 100 pounds, your body can pretty easily do that. If you weigh 120 pounds, it's going to have a very difficult time because the body doesn't want to cannibalize itself. If for some reason it's an appropriate thing to try a ketogenic diet for a period of time when you're that thin, if there's an actual reason to do that, then the mistake I see people making is they just don't add in a lot of fat. And if you don't do that, the liver will not have any fuel and you can't produce those ketones, which means you're not in one camp or the other. You're not burning sugar, you're not burning fat, you're just fuel deprived and you're completely out of energy. So that's a problem. That's a common mistake that I see people make. Um, Sometimes people are trying really hard to be in ketosis and they're eating plenty of good fats, but they're also having the attitude that, I'm doing really well here. I'm mostly compliant. I just occasionally cheat. And what that looks like is eating just enough carbohydrate at many meals or having a little treat here and there that it stimulates enough of an insulin response that the signal in the body is, well, we're not in ketosis, we've been fed. So the thing to know about this is that when insulin is down, you're fasting as far as how the body perceives it. When insulin is up, you've been fed. So if you're trying to mimic the fasting state so that you get some of the metabolic benefits of that, and you eat enough carbohydrate to trigger an insulin response, it doesn't matter that it was only one cookie. That sometimes I talk to people and they say, hey, I had a really nice piece of salmon, I had a large salad with an avocado, and I drizzled it with extra virgin olive oil. And I'm thinking, high five, that's great. You're doing really well. And then they say, so, I figured I was basically there, so I just ate one cookie. I'm not saying that eating a cookie is a bad thing. That's not why I'm bringing this up at all. What I'm saying is if your goal is to be in ketosis and you eat the cookie and you stimulate that insulin response, the signal to the body is, oh, we're not in ketosis. And so it starts muddying the water. You got to live in one world or another. Now, more can be said about that. I'll save that for the discussion. The next thing that I want to point out, though, is let's imagine that you're forgetting about supplements, you're forgetting about medication for the time being. You're just focused on the foundation. We talked about what are you eating? How are you fueling your body? How's that working for you? The second thing is, am I physically active? Am I doing things to maintain muscle mass? Muscles matter because they have a higher concentration of mitochondria than a lot of other tissues in the body. And if you're losing muscle mass, you're losing energy production capacity. And over time, we're all at risk of losing muscle mass. And as that increases, that also can affect our mobility. So when it comes to physical activity, consistency wins. And if we're struggling to consistently get out and move our bodies throughout the day, then that's a crack in the foundation. It's something to focus on. If you're getting to the gym in the morning, that's fantastic. But then if you're sitting at a desk for 20 whatever hours in the day and you're sleeping on top of it, then you're basically spending 30 to 60 minutes a day doing what the body was meant to do and moving, and the rest of the time you're sedentary. And sometimes I joke with people that makes you an active couch potato. So we need to consistently move throughout the day. And if you're struggling with that, one of the top things I'd recommend is come to office hours on Wednesdays with Dan and John from 7 Movements Health and let them help you start figuring out how to have more wins and how to be a little bit more consistent through some microdose exercising. Another critical part of the foundation is sleep. And I love to remind people that you have to sleep to be superior. I met with someone earlier today who doesn't get to bed sometimes until 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. This person's really out of sync with natural circadian rhythms. And they're having some significant brain health challenges even though they're at an age that you typically wouldn't expect to see those kinds of things. And this person's really wanting to get to a better state of health, and they're taking truckloads of supplements. Well, the supplements aren't going to solve a crack in the foundation like I don't get good sleep. So we have to work on things like that, and then we can build on top of that foundation. So sleep is critical, just to remind you, or if you're not aware of it, it's critical because of the glymphatic system. The glymphatic system is like running your dishwasher at night. The lymphatic system, the sewer of the body, does not extend past the blood-brain barrier. And researchers back in about 2014 figured out that the brain really does have a glymphatic system. When you're asleep, the brain shrinks just a little bit, and the fluid-filled spaces, the ventricles, open up. The body makes about 1.5 cups of new cerebrospinal fluid, and it bathes the brain in that fluid. And when we're in really deep sleep, there's also a sort of pumping action that occurs. There are slow waves of norepinephrine that are produced, and those waves sort of start cycling, and there's this pumping action that takes misfolded proteins and cellular waste and debris and sort of pumps them up into this cerebrospinal fluid and flushes it out. So we're taking out the trash when the glymphatic system is running. If we are not sleeping 7 or more hours a night and cycling through all these stages of sleep really effectively, we're not taking out the trash. So there are different things that will affect our ability to sleep well and to cycle through these stages of sleep. If you have a crowded airway, like you see on the screen, what's called the Mallampati classification system. Dr. Mallampati was a doctor in India who years ago was trying to figure out how hard it would be to intubate patients, and he wanted a way of rating the difficulty of intubating someone. If you have a nice open airway when you stick out your tongue, like the class 1 picture that you see there, then that person's easy to stick a tube down their throat if you have to do that. If someone sticks out their tongue and says, ah, and it looks like the last picture to the right, the class 4 picture, they're much more difficult to intubate because you've got this big tongue that's in the way. Sometimes older adults, or actually younger adults even for that matter, sometimes they're thin, but they have a really big tongue relative to the size of the mouth. That actually makes them at risk for obstructive sleep apnea. And yet they usually don't get screened because the stereotype of sleep apnea is what you see on the screen. People think of men especially with a great big thick neck closing off the airway. Well, yeah, they are at risk for obstructive sleep apnea. But I've seen people who are very, very thin who also have obstructive sleep apnea, and it's never been diagnosed. If you haven't been screened for sleep apnea, it's definitely something to consider. And a lot of primary care offices have an overnight oximetry device where they could screen. They could look at whether or not you have low oxygen events at night, and then you could have a more extensive sleep study to figure out how to deal with the problem. Actually, before we go on to stress management, I'll say just a couple of other things about sleep. If you're taking sleeping medication to try to sleep, you might be able to fall asleep, but it could be causing problems with the glymphatic system. There's recent research that shows drugs like Ambien, the generic would be Zolpidem. There are a class of medications called hypnotics. They're sleeping pills. Those medications interfere with the production of norepinephrine. That's the neurotransmitter that is produced in slow waves to produce that pumping action. And it's now been shown that although you might fall asleep with something like Ambien, it's preventing you from correctly cycling through these stages of sleep and clearing waste. And that causes problems over time. It's one of the reasons why those medications should not be used in older adults. It's also important to recognize that if you're drinking alcohol, that disrupts the ability to get into REM sleep. So again, you're not cycling through the stages of sleep. Those things are foundational. And yet when someone is feeling chronically fatigued, instead of looking at the foundation and saying, well, let's really dig into sleep. How effectively am I sleeping? Am I even tracking it? Um, Instead of doing that, most people want to grab a supplement that is supposed to help people have more energy. Or they want to ask about medication that might be helpful with something like chronic fatigue, because the natural default mode for us as humans is to reach for the easy thing first instead of just taking steps forward to deal with foundational issues. Stress management is pretty critical for how our overall system is operating. Everybody has heard that stress is a killer. We know that. And yet it's so easy to neglect that and think that getting to a better place is a matter of a supplement that we're taking or a medication that we can take. If we're feeling stressed, it's more likely that someone will want a Xanax than to really engage in an intentional effort to regularly counterbalance stress. When stress goes up, it's an opportunity to ask ourselves, what am I doing to counterbalance this? When we're really stressed, we sort of go into fight or flight. The sympathetic nervous system gets activated. And the counterbalance is to do things to activate the parasympathetic nervous system, our rest and relax part of the nervous system. Well, how do we do that? I love this graphic from Ari Whitten. Ari Whitten talks about ways to stimulate the ventral side of the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve connects the brain and the gut, and it's a bidirectional highway. There's communication back and forth all the time. And anything that stimulates the ventral side of the vagus nerve, which is the side closest to your chest, anything that stimulates that is going to improve our ability to rest and relax. It's going to counterbalance and to calm things down. So whether you like meditating or singing or chanting or humming or gargling or doing yoga or laughing or doing breathing exercises, any of the things that you see here on this list are stimulating that parasympathetic rest and relax response. And doing this is kind of like going to the gym for your nervous system. For your muscles, if you go to the gym once, you might not see a whole lot of effect from that unless you overtrain and then you're sore for a few days. If you're trying to get a lot stronger, though, everybody knows one trip to the gym is not going to cut it. If you're trying to stimulate the rest and relax part of your nervous system, one yoga session, one meditation session, one breathwork session, it's not going to do it. But consistently doing it a little bit every day wins. So again, consistency is the key in all this. Now, what about brain training? I've said before that if you want to have a better brain, you have to give your brain a reason to make new synaptic connections. You have to train it. You have to push it a little bit. I don't know if anybody saw the recent Caregiver Minute video that I posted about some new research on brain training, but there is phenomenal new research. It followed people for 20 years, and it found that when they did a specific type of brain training called speed training, which is available in the Brain HQ app that some of you use, when you do speed training, it's dynamically adjusting, and you're basically looking for certain visual stimuli and you're picking it out, and it gets harder and harder with time. When you do that, the results now in a decades-long research study is that it can have a dramatic effect on dementia risk. It can reduce dementia risk by 25%, and it's durable over at least 20 years. That's how far they studied it. That's how far we know it has an effect. So what would you do for brain training? Well, using Brain HQ as an app, 10 minutes a day is one good place to start. It's also important to learn new skills. If you've always wanted to learn to play a particular instrument, start. My wife recently came out of retirement as a piano teacher because an elderly neighbor who's in her 70s talked to my wife and said, I've decided that I finally have time to learn to play the piano. I've wanted to do it my whole life. Why not now? I'm doing fine. And so she comes over on Wednesday afternoons and my wife gives her a piano lesson. I think it's wonderful. Doing brain training could be as simple as doing activities with your non-dominant hand, whether it's eating or carrying something in a way that you wouldn't normally carry it. You could do bilateral asymmetry exercises where one hand is doing something different than the other hand. We've talked about that a little bit before. For the sake of time, I'll revisit that in the Q&A if we need to. We've talked before about dental health. I think some people are still reaching for the easy wins with a supplement or a medication without fully paying attention to the foundation. If you're experiencing serious brain health challenges, or maybe you're serving someone who has serious challenges, and you have not taken a hard look at dental health, that's a place to look. A significant number of people who donate their brains to science and die with Alzheimer's disease are found to have P. gingivalis bacteria living in the brain. That's the bacteria that causes gum disease. Now, some of you are familiar with this story, but if you're not, I'm going to share it here, and it's a good reminder for everybody. The picture here is of a woman named Gina, and I took this screenshot a few years ago when Gina came and spoke to our masterclass. Gina is from Michigan, and in her late 50s, she developed Parkinson's disease, and it progressed rapidly, and it got so bad that it forced her into early retirement, and she could not feed herself, she couldn't apply makeup, she couldn't wipe her own bottom. She couldn't get dressed. She could hardly walk at all. She could go like 3 feet. So she was basically wheelchair bound. And in a last-ditch effort to try to do something about all this, somehow she heard about A Mind for All Seasons, and she ended up traveling to Idaho, and she spent a month in Idaho, in Pocatello, working with Randy at his clinic there. And she basically said, do whatever you possibly can think of to help me get on top of this and get better results. And as part of that, Randy said, okay, I want you to go to a dentist friend and get a cone beam CT scan of the mouth. And she said, well, I go to the dentist 3 times a year. I actually pay for an extra trip to the dentist because I like to have a really nice, clean mouth. I brush and floss every day, religiously. And I have a clean bill of health every time I go to the dentist. So why would I need to do that? And Randy said, look, you told me you want me to do everything. There are certain types of dental problems that don't show up on traditional x-rays. If you've had root canals and you remove the root to a tooth, you're removing the supply of oxygen-rich blood. And there are certain microbes called anaerobes that flourish in a low oxygen environment. And Randy said, I have to rule that out if we're going to do everything here. And she said, okay, I'll go to the dentist. So she went off to his dentist friend who did a special CT scan of the mouth and found 3 areas where spirochetes and other microbes had flourished because root canals had gone bad. And over time, they had etched away bone and created a clear, very tiny but clear channel where microscopic bacteria could be entering the bloodstream. So the dentist helped Gina do extensive reconstruction. They did about $10,000 of dental work and repaired some things. And within 3 months, she had a 95% reduction of her symptoms. I don't know if anybody here was on that masterclass a few years ago. I don't recall. But I will never forget her getting up from the camera and saying, I want to show you something. And she walked to the back of her dining room that's in the background there. And we were all cheering because she walked. She said, no, that's not it. Let me show you what I can do. And she started cranking out jumping jacks. It was a dramatic change that Gina had from eliminating the root cause issue and by paying attention to the foundation instead of worrying so much about what was above ground. So in the end, I would remind you of what I call the parable of the swing. And some of you have heard this. This is new to some of you. When I was a boy, my dad built a large play tower for us. And I was really excited by this. It was impressive. It was almost 2 stories tall, and it had these big, long swings. So think of a play tower with a beam going across the top of it and these big, long chains attached to a swing, kind of like you see here. And my brothers and I would stand on the seat of those swings, and we would pump up and down. And we do it for hours sometimes, especially in the summer months. or we'd come home from school during the school year and we'd go out and we'd play on the swing set. And I loved getting to where I was pumping up really high, and then the swing would kind of catch a little bit. The chains would have just a moment of slack in them, and it felt like I was falling, and then the chains would catch again, and I'd go swinging back. And it was really fun for a couple of years until one day on the backswing, the chain broke. And I went flying over the fence and I landed on a log and I was injured. I was actually lucky not to be paralyzed from it. It caused some issues with my neck that left me in a neck brace for the whole rest of the summer. I was that kid walking around with a big, thick foam neck brace on. And what we didn't know when my dad built that play tower, and what we didn't know all the time that I was swinging, is that the chains at the top were connected to eye bolts and they would rub. And I thought that everything was fine. I had no idea that there was a problem. Neither did my parents until the chain broke. Sometimes people say what you don't know won't hurt you. And it was that day that I learned that what you don't know might kill you, or at least significantly injure you. In our lives, if we are not paying attention to foundational things, we might think that we're doing just fine, that we're doing everything that we possibly can. Meanwhile, the chain is rubbing. And if we don't pay attention to that, if we don't inspect things, if we don't look a little bit more closely and really ask ourselves, are there cracks in my foundation? Then we're not going to have really lasting effects when it comes to our health. We won't get the results that we could otherwise get. Now, before we go to a little discussion, I want to point out one thing. A lot of people here in our membership have had some blood work done. They've gotten a roadmap report, and we've looked at things like nutrient deficiencies, hormonal deficiencies, inflammatory markers that are elevated. And we've talked about various supplements that research has shown can be helpful in those kinds of situations. If I'm not careful in a discussion like this, some people are going to say, well, wait a minute. You guys talk about supplements all the time. And now you're saying that that's less important. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm suggesting is we need to start with a good, solid foundation and always be aware of how these foundational things are affecting us. On top of that, we still want to build the house. So let me give you a quick analogy. Let's suppose you got the foundation right. It wasn't the scenario I talked about earlier where you show up and the foundation's cracking from the get-go. No, they pour the perfect foundation. If you start building the house and the framing crew comes in and they don't measure anything, they just say, well, we need a wall over there, and this is probably about right. The house is not going to turn out looking very good. The walls won't be square. They won't match up in the right ways. Maybe when you go to try to put the roof trusses on, things don't fit the way that they were designed because you didn't even measure anything. When you measure something like your thiamine level or your folate level or your pregnenolone level or any of the other things that are fundamental to how cells produce energy, when you measure it and then you do something about it and then you remeasure and you adjust, that's kind of like building the house in a meticulous way. You're being careful. You're measuring the boards. You're checking them. You're cutting them carefully, and you assemble it in just the right way. That's very different than getting the foundation right and then eyeballing everything else. So these things work together, and I think it's important to understand that, to make that point so that I'm not misunderstood here. But I've just thrown out some ideas about how important it is to focus on foundational things. Let's make sure that we don't have cracks in the foundation. Let's discuss this a little bit now. Let's find out some of your thoughts. And I would invite you, if you're sort of wrestling with, well, where do I go in all this? Where do I even start thinking about this? Ask yourself, how's my foundation when it comes to brain training, exercise, diet, dental health, sleep, stress management? How am I doing? Where am I stuck? Let's talk about those kinds of things. So I'm going to look in the chat here. Yeah, Rhett called out something I said. What's simple to do is simple not to do. Thank you for calling that out. It's just human nature. Um, Rhett further says, I'm one of those cutting carbs, but also trying to put on muscle. What additional suggestions do you have to ensure I've got enough glycogen in my muscle? Great question. Um, from what you know so far, how would you respond to that if someone else asked you?
Um, I don't think I think my understanding falls short in this context. I know that there are many folks who immediately before a serious workout will do some carb loading or whatever they call it, to make sure that you have enough glucose to burn and so forth there. But I don't understand the role that the glucose might play in the glycogen, or even, frankly, what the glycogen does within the muscle.
Okay. Um, Thanks for being candid, and let's unpack that just a little bit. When you eat carbohydrate and it just breaks down to glucose, your body will first use it in the moment if there's a reason to really be using it. So let's say that you're out running a marathon. Sometimes those marathon runners will have glucose packets and they'll slurp it down,
Yeah,
and that keeps them going. Well, they're using that in real time.
immediately. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So that's the first place it goes. The second place that glucose tends to go is to replace glycogen storage. And glycogen storage is a little bit like a modest sized refrigerator. You can store a fair amount of stuff in there, but when it comes to glycogen stores that are used to power the muscle, we have enough storage capacity to last about a day. If you're active and you're using things, you can store enough for a day. Um, the other storage capacity, though, is like having a double wide chest freezer or something where you can really store fuel for the long haul. If you go look at my mother's chest freezer, even though my parents have been empty nesters for decades, that thing is crammed full for a lot of reasons, but they like to host dinners some Sundays in the month, and they'll have the whole extended family come over. So they keep stuff in there. They have a lot of storage. And in the body, we have a lot of storage capacity in the form of fat. So when we have excess carbohydrates that can't be used in the moment, and by the way, as an interesting side note, we only need about 1 teaspoon of glucose in the bloodstream to be able to power the things that are essential from having glucose. So we just need very, very little. And if you don't eat it, the body can make it. So there's not a massive glucose requirement to survive. But if we've used what we're going to use in real time, and then we've stored whatever we can store as glycogen in the muscles, then the liver converts the rest into triglycerides and ends up packing things around our midsection as fat. And we just haul that extra fuel with us wherever we go, which is why people can survive in a concentration camp for a long, long time. People can fast for extended periods. And as long as they have enough fluid and they keep their electrolytes in check, they can actually do pretty well because they
I
have
watched,
extra fuel.
if anybody's seen the television series Alone, or I shouldn't say television, I don't know. I think it's on Netflix, but Alone is a survival sort of TV show where folks come in and they're isolated in some remote forest in, Saskatchewan or something, I don't know. And one of the strategies is to put on a ton of weight before you go. And that's how one of the finalists survived to the end. He had almost nothing to eat, but he had 175 pounds that he could afford to lose.
Wow.
And it
Uh,
was like 2 months or more. I don't remember, but
wow. Interesting strategy. Interesting show. I've never seen that, but so the idea with glycogen is that's basically fuel to specifically power the muscles. So back to your original question, um, knowing you as I do, your goal with ketosis is brain health and mental clarity and overall metabolic health. Um, and I like that. I understand that. I eat very ketogenically during the day because I want my sugars to be very steady. I don't want spikes and crashes while I'm doing brain work like I'm doing right now. But a strategy for replacing glycogen stores would be something like I do lots of Saturday mornings. It's common that I might go out for, often my wife and I will walk 5 or 6 miles. Sometimes I go out for a run. She's not as much of a runner, but I might go out and run 5 to 7 miles and then come back and lift weights. Well, by then I've burned through a lot of glycogen, and so I might have a recovery meal that involves significant amounts of protein. I might eat 3 or 4 scrambled eggs. I might have a piece of salmon. I might have a whole chicken breast or something like that. So you've got to have protein, which is the building block of muscle, and then you've got to pair it with carbohydrate because in order to build muscle, you need to replace glycogen and stimulate an insulin response. So carbohydrate will do that. And what that might look like is maybe I have some roasted potatoes. Maybe I have some black rice. Maybe I also include some fruit with that. Have an apple, for example, along with some of those other carbs. So it's real food. I'm not saying, oh, that's the time to go start buying Twinkies or something like that. Um, but you time that so that you're intentionally replacing those glycogen stores and you're building muscle. Does that make sense? Okay. Um, you also asked if I'm in ketosis, but have
You
very
could,
little or no fat to convert. Will my body begin breaking down muscle instead of fat? Have I understood that correctly? Um, yeah, in some cases, you do end up breaking down muscle. If people are too focused on a ketogenic diet and they're thin, then over the long haul, they might lose more muscle mass. And so we have to be thoughtful in the approach. I don't live in ketosis myself. I kind of cycle out in the evenings. I trend toward ketosis by the late afternoon. My body starts producing ketones later in the day, which helps me have an improving energy level by the late afternoon. But most of the time in the evening, I liberalize my diet a little bit. I have some starches. I have potatoes or sweet potatoes, or um, I like black rice. And that's what works for me. Now, again, you have to personalize this. That's not the answer for everybody, but you're in a similar state, Rhett. That might be something that's helpful for you that you could try.
that's great. Thank you.
Um, okay, so Greg asked, can you tell us a little bit more about the Brain HQ app? Yes. So there are various apps out there that purportedly do brain training, and many of them are not based on any real science. Brain HQ is very different. It was developed by Dr. Mike Merzenich. He is the researcher who first coined the term neuroplasticity. Decades ago, he was the guy that recognized the brain is moldable, it's plastic, it's changeable if you stimulate it in the right sorts of ways. And he got frustrated that there was so much coming out that was called brain training and it was not based in any legitimate neuroscience. And he said, well, we know what actually works. We know how to stimulate the brain. We'll create something. And Brain HQ has been the subject of a lot of different research trials. It's used at stroke rehab hospitals in various parts of the world very effectively. And it is an app that has a variety of different exercises that you can use to stimulate different cognitive processes. And one of the reasons it's effective is that it's not static. You don't do the same thing over and over at the same level. It actually gets harder. It tracks your progress. It pushes you more. And it's that pushing you more that actually gives the brain a reason to be more plastic and to respond to it. So it's kind of like exercise. If you go to the gym and you always lift exactly the same amount of weight, like I talk to older women all the time who are part of their regular program, and for the last 5 years they've been going to Silver Sneakers or Fit and Fall Proof or whatever, and they sit there with 2 to 5 pound weights for 5 years, doing the same thing over and over. That is not building new muscle. Maybe it's maintaining some things. It's way better than sitting home. I love that they're getting socialization and that they're continuing to move. But 26 years ago, when I started working in assisted living as a program director, we had a large gym filled with equipment that was pneumatic. So you'd push a button and it would create resistance through air. So it was gentle on the joints and safe. You weren't at risk of dropping a weight or something. And we set up a program with a physical therapist where he worked with people when they first came in under Medicare coverage if they qualified for it. And he would get them improving. And then he would transition them to a program that we had in-house. And we literally had a sheet of paper with their name on it, and had various exercises, and we would track how much weight did they do last time they were in. And gradually over time, we'd add a pound and we'd add another pound. And I watched 85, 90-year-old frail women build muscle mass. They would go from starting out with 2 pounds to 5 pounds. And sometimes I'd look back and I'd say, wow, you've been at this for a year and a half, and you're lifting 20 pounds. And when you started, you could only lift 5. That's impressive. They were building muscle mass. So, in the same way, with brain training, it's got to be dynamic. It's got to push you just a little bit. It needs to be hard. Um, Greg, did I answer your question? Or did I meander enough that I lost you? Okay, we're good, says Pamela. Thank you. Perspective of trying a blood glucose monitor for everyone starting the program because we all respond differently to different foods. Absolutely. I'm a really big fan of continuous glucose monitors because data drives decisions. And when you see how your body is responding in real time and you can see patterns and learn from that, it's really impactful. So the easiest way to get one these days is to go to Stelo, STELO.com, and you get a direct-to-consumer continuous glucose monitor. They'll ship 2 of them to your house. So that's the easy button unless you're a diabetic and your insurance would cover it.
Eric, can I add some commentary?
Please.
Um, Something else you might consider, it's more expensive, I suspect, than Stilo, but could be a sort of add-on. I, for almost a year, did Levels. And what I
Hmm.
liked about the Levels app is that, yes, it connected to my glucose monitor, but I also could take a picture of the food I was going to eat, and it would use AI to estimate, guess at everything that's on my plate, how much there was, and what protein was there, what fat was there, what sugar was there. Um, it was really useful, and if money's not a huge barrier, boy, it saves a ton of time compared to trying to track all your carbs and garbage. But then later on, it can, once there's a sort of baseline of substantive data, it starts giving personalized observations about how your sugar is responding to the various food inputs that you've provided. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great comment.
Also, it was a company that was created in part by the, um, I hope soon to be Surgeon General, Dr. Casey Means,
Yeah.
Stanford educated, brilliant surgeon and preventive medicine physician.
Yep. Yep. Love that. Thank you, Rhett. Other questions or comments? Is there anything that you thought about as we were discussing the foundation where you're thinking, oh, maybe I've been too focused on building the house instead of paying attention to the foundation? Is there anything that maybe you think that you should revisit?
Hey,
Carol?
maybe stress management needs to be number one, because when you look at all the other things, if you're not doing them, that just ups your stress.
Yeah, that's a great point.
because there's so much to do, and yeah, just can get overwhelming.
Yeah. Yeah. Love that. What's your favorite stress management technique?
Well, I'm learning some different ones. I'm experimenting with tapping, the EFT,
Mhm. Yeah.
and I can't say I'm an expert by any stretch of the imagination. Life often feels like whack-a-mole, and with things coming at me so fast, but just doing the best I can.
Love that. Well, I'm going to segue from that.
Mhm.
I want to comment on Bridget's comment here, but speaking of stress management and anxiety responses and things like that we deal with, um, our next masterclass is going to be with Mandy Morris, who is a member of our community, but she's a licensed professional counselor, and she tends to be busy during this time. So you almost never see her in masterclass. But she and some business partners developed a tool called So Free, and you access it on your phone, but it's a stress management and anxiety tool, and it's very easy to use. And we're going to talk about how to access that for free and to help beta test that. But it's based
Oh
on a
yeah.
tremendous amount of research of what it takes to better manage stress and to calm our systems down. And she's going to come and talk all about that next week. So I'm excited for that.
That'll be awesome. Perfect
Yeah.
timing, because I've got a PCP trying to talk me into an antidepressant and just all kinds of crazy stuff right now. And they've
Mhm.
adjustments to thyroid medication and just a lot of things. And I'm just trying to breathe.
Yeah. One thing I might say about that is certainly there's a place for various medications, and I'm not anti-medication, and nor is Randy. He's talked about that a lot of times. But I do think that when it comes to mental health, one thing to always consider for all of us is that I think we should avoid over medicalizing normal human experience. When someone dies, when someone has very poor health, when we lose a job, when we have a major setback, when a relationship ends, when something really difficult happens, it's normal to struggle with that, to not feel as well. And sometimes there's a tendency to over medicalize it and say, oh my goodness, this is a problem and we need to treat you. I personally think that it's okay to say, I don't feel really good right now. I'm going through some stuff. That's part of life. That's part of what actually adds richness. We need hard times so that we appreciate times that are better. You can't understand sweet without some bitter. So I think that's important to keep in mind. Um, okay, just a couple other comments before we wrap up here. Bridget is talking about moving dinner up from 5:30 to 5, presumably to try to give a little bit more of a window because fasting is foundational. Um, yeah, another way that you could look at that is if you have a resident that is struggling more with metabolic health problems, maybe they are the first one to dinner and the last one who comes to breakfast so that you stretch it for them just a little bit more. It's tricky in long-term care because at least in most states, and I realize Indiana is a little bit different, but at least in most states, there's a rule about how long you can go. In Idaho, it's generally 14 hours. You don't go more than 14 hours between a substantial evening meal and breakfast. Um, Sarah says, I need to plan meals better instead of not eating all day because I'm too busy. Yes, so true. Um, just a comment on that. There's a cartoon that I saw years ago. I'll find it and I'll have to bring it to another masterclass, but I love this cartoon. It's a single picture and it shows a couple of Stone Age guys with this stone box on what are supposed to be wheels, but they are square. And there's this long track where it's being dragged through the dirt. And these two guys have straps over their shoulders and they're pulling this thing. And so the stone box is full of rocks and it's got these square wheels on it. And you've got this other Stone Age guy with a couple of round stone wheels for sale. And he's pointing to them. And the two guys pulling the other cart say, "No thanks, we're too busy." You get the idea. Sometimes we have to slow down to speed up. Sometimes what allows us to get a whole lot more work done is to stop work sooner and prioritize rest and recovery and to sleep really well and to spend time de-stressing and to go do the thing with our family that we need to do. Or for me, sometimes I've got to stop and just go sit down and play the piano for a while because that's really de-stressing for me. And then when I do get back to the work, I get things done 3 times as fast.
Mm.
So dull knives don't cut very well. And I think you just were inspired about something, Sarah, that can make a really big difference in your life. Bridget says maybe take a walk midday without your phone. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. You
That's
okay.
what I tried to make her the other day. I tried to make her just leave her phone down and just go walk, and she wouldn't do it. Or she took her phone and it only lasted 15 minutes instead of an hour or 30 minutes. And then somebody else told her, "Yes, listen, you need to slow down to speed up."
I took a walk today, Bridget.
Yay! Gold star.
Yeah, that's a good segue to a quote that I'll leave you with. I've collected quotes for years, and one of my favorites says, "It's only the view from where you sit that makes you feel defeat. Life is full of many aisles, so why don't you change your seat?" So if something is not working for you, try something different. And oftentimes we get stuck in a rut for no other reason than the story that we tell ourselves. The story that, "Oh, I can't do this, I'm too busy." That's a story. Everybody has the same 24 hours in the day. And we can make different choices. And we can learn from them. And when I was first an administrator in assisted living, I prided myself on trying to respond to every last email and phone call and everything that came in immediately, as fast as I could. And I was training people that, "Oh, just ask Eric and he'll get back to you in 5 minutes," which was a recipe for burnout and disaster. And as soon as I started telling myself a different story and trying to empower people more to solve their own problems, and maybe sometimes didn't respond immediately because I had other important things going on, it was amazing how often people would send a follow-up email that would say, "Never mind, I figured it out. Sorry to bug you." I'm not saying that we shouldn't be responsive, but we all have situations in life where we could make a different choice and it might turn out even better. So we need people around us like each other where we can remind ourselves of all the good things.